Well, just a reminder, we're picking back up we talked about covert integrity. We're in room 1, and we're talking about covert phase integrity abuse behaviors and conditions. Behaviors are the things we do. The conditions are what is created by those behaviors. And one of those conditions, or one thing that circles through all of this, is that concept called complex trauma shaping. You can think of it as CTS 6. And what that is it's patterns of harm over time where a victim can't escape, shapes the psyche slowly. And it shapes it in these 6 areas, especially. You can often, Manuel has a slide I did not use, but he has a slide showing a human in with 6 major vertebrae. And so you can see these are 6 major vertebrae that make up who we are as people. That's what our psyche means, okay? And so over time, gaslighting, the IMR, the creating of this world, the maintaining of this world, the shaping information, etc., especially over time, begins to adversely shape and distort how our wives live in these different areas. And I'm just going to go through them quickly, and then we're going to circle back and go through it. It affects their emotions. It affects their thoughts. It affects how they relate to their self. It affects how they see their abuser, how they see us. It affects how they relate to other humans. And it affects their sense of meaning in the psyche. So let's start with emotions. So the question is, how have the patterns of harm shaped the emotional system and regulation over time? Okay, one of the things that has forced to happen is we shut down our feelings. We shut down emotions. Okay? What emotions has the person experienced as a result of these harmful patterns and the damage that has been done? And then the flip side of that is how the person copes with these emotions. Okay, that's what emotional regulation is. We all have emotions, we all have strong emotions. How do we handle them? One of the most common things that happens in this complex trauma shaping syndrome is we develop systems how not to feel. We live in numb. And that's what our wives experience. So what is the current emotional routing system? How are emotions, how are feelings, how do they express themselves, how are they lived out in her life? The second way it impacts is it affects how she thinks. It affects her cognitive system. How have the patterns of harm shaped the person's thoughts, their patterns of beliefs over time? Patterns of distortions or thought strategies in order to survive and cope become maladaptive. Just like it did for us in childhood, just as things in our childhood led us to a place of developing a maladaptive coping mechanism of sexual fantasy, sexual acting out, etc. Our wives under a system like this often also develop maladaptive patterns or distortions. It also distorts how they see life. Okay? You know, even in that Carol Burnett skit that we all laughed about. Okay? Some of those were distortions of her cognitive ability, how she just recognized things. You know, asking questions that we think are kind of ridiculous. You know, why would somebody call a wrong number at 2:30 in the morning? Okay. Well, her brain has become into a place where she's asking questions that maybe a person who's not been through that kind of experience would never ask. It leads to negative core beliefs. How many of your wives have commented on how they believe that they are ugly or worthless, unlovable, etc.? Some of you are saying, well, she had that from childhood. She got that from her family of origin. Maybe. And maybe she had a level of it, and then your betrayals and your IMR and your secret sexual basement just put it in concrete. Sometimes it works in lack of thoughts, deficits in insight, lack of self-reflection as a coping strategy. I just don't think, I don't face anything. Alterations in consciousness, amnesia, disassociating thoughts. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to wives and they've said, I just seem like I can't remember anything. Well, disassociation is just not staying in the present. It's taking, the mind going somewhere else. But with that, there's oftentimes a sense of, I don't remember what's happened. Okay? We do that. Many of us have done that, especially with our childhood. One of the real resistant points I often get from men is, well, I don't see any point in going back and working on my childhood. I don't remember much of it anyway. The less you remember of your childhood, the more important it is to dig into your childhood. Because there are significant reasons that we don't remember those kind of things. Okay? How did this person's thought system get shaped? How have the distortions weathered the rock and changed the very shape of the rock? Okay? It also has impact on their relationship with their own ego, their own sense of self, their own sense of who am I? How have the patterns of harm shaped the self over time? How does my wife see herself? What kind of self-contact does she have? How self-aware is she? What is her self-esteem, her self-worth? How is her self even structured? Is it fragmented, or does she see herself as a harmonious whole? That has been greatly impacted by how our world, especially the IMR, the intentionally manipulated reality, has impacted her. Relationship with her own ego, how she sees herself. What is the person's relationship to the self now, and how much self-contact do they even have? How do they cope and regulate their own self-states? Do they have adequate self-worth? The fourth thing we need to see is how does the abuse itself impact on how they see the one who has inflicted it? How have the patterns of harm shaped how the person relates to abuse? How they understand it and how they react over time? Okay, how do they see the one who's harmed them? A phrase many of you have heard me use many times is normal is what you know, no matter how screwed up it is. Unfortunately, many women just accept many of these things because that's their normal. That's how it's always been. That's how it'll always be. So they've lost the ability to speak up. Or particular abuses, particular integrity abuse behaviors. Well, if I spoke up every time that happened, that's all we would do is fight about it. So they learn it's easier just to live with it. Okay? Identification with the abuse is a coping strategy. Can't beat him, might as well join him. He says I'm pathetic, so I'll just agree with him. I'm pathetic. Okay? Disassociation, learned compliance, acceptance, and normalization. Yeah, I'll go ahead and throw this in here. It's a real tragedy how many wives, one wife in particular that I've talked to off and on for many years now, and very controlling religious system, and so she bought into it. She decided, okay, the way that we can make this work is I'll give him sex multiple times a day. Guess what? Still wasn't enough. She normalized it to the point of whatever, and guess how she survived that? Guess how she continued in that pattern? Totally disassociated. He was having sex with her body. He was not having sex with her. That's horrifically sad, guys. Yeah, it's horrifically sad that many of our wives have had to disassociate in order to be with us and give us what they think we want. Okay? It also affects how they relate to humans in general. So you ask the question, how have the patterns of harm shaped how the person relates to human beings over time? Hey, how do they relate to people in general? How are their attachment systems functioning? Many live in a place where, there are many women in this place who go to a very dismissive attachment style because they're hurt so badly that the solution is to shut down. Others become even more anxiously attached because, okay, I need connection. I try to get it from my husband, and the only way that he connects to me is sexually. But even when we connect sexually, we really don't connect. Okay? It affects intimacy skills, comfort level needs, and ways of being intimate. How safe or not safe does a person feel with other human beings? Any of your wives ever make a statement like, "How can I trust anyone?" Or, "How can I trust any man?" I've worked with many couples through the years where the wife just inherently mistrusts me simply because I'm a man. Or because she knows that I've had some of these issues in the past, so therefore she believes I'm going to automatically side with her husband. As many of you know, the opposite is much more likely. But I 100% get why so many wives feel that way. Okay? Do they feel loved or not by other human beings? Many wives who've lived in these systems can be in church groups, they can be in other places, and they just constantly say, "I don't fit in. No one really likes me." How much of that has been deeply impacted by this system of IMR? Intentionally manipulated reality. How much of this has been impacted by all the gaslighting? How much of this has been impacted by all the times that they've discovered that I thought he was doing well, but he wasn't? It also affects, 6, their sense of meaning in the psyche. How do I make meaning? How do I understand? How do I understand values, motivations, core agendas? How do I understand things like purpose? What is actually meaningful to me? Do you realize how many wives have completely given up things that used to be incredibly meaningful to them? Now, Kansas, middle of the country. We're a little removed from this. But I've heard from many wives through the years, and there's some of the quotes from Minwala and stuff, of wives who say, the beach was my favorite place. And now even the thought of going near a beach is horrific for me. Okay? How does the person make meaning of life? Going all the way back, Genesis chapter 3. In Genesis 3, after Adam and Eve fall, God comes and He tells them what I prefer not to call curses, but the consequences. Because you have unleashed the power of sin in the world, this is what a fallen world is going to look like. And as we know for Adam, He said, you're going to work hard and you're going to be frustrated in it. And so to Adam and to man, I think part of what He says is you're going to have a sinful inclination to seek your identity from your work and what you do. Anybody relate to that besides me? To Eve, He says, your husband will, and just pulled a blank on the quote, your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. See where I'm going here? Eve, representation of woman, has a sinful inclination, instead of seeking her identity from God, to seek her identity from where? From husband, from family. But when she's in this kind of system, and she's seeking her meaning of life from her husband, who is acting out, IMRing her, creating her secret world, etc., it blows it up. What in truth really seems to give life any meaning? What is the meaning of the future for that human being? What do I have to look forward to? In this world, it leaves it completely devoid. That's room 2. Let's move on, room 1. Let's move on to room 3. Room 3, Dr. Minwala calls the erosion of relational integrity. So the picture there is 2 tuning forks. And are they matched in tune? Relational integrity, room 3, is the erosion of an energetic system. Okay, this gets a little bit, some people have a little trouble with this, but let's just be honest. We all understand the energy that flows between people, right? For example, I love this morning hearing the energy in the room of guys connecting. A number of you haven't seen each other in person before, but you've been on Zoom together. Or some of you haven't seen each other since, last summer in Colorado. And so there's an energy, there's a vibration you can feel that is part of our enteric system, that's part of that communication that goes back and forth between people. And so when that energy is good, you can think of it as good vibes. There's a balance that goes back and forth. All right? But a secret sexual basement and integrity abuse alters the energy system on which that relationship connects. Okay? And so whenever there is good energy going back and forth, transmission is optimal. There's a high frequency energy waves going back and forth. There's a congruence between the waves. There's a harmonious flow. There's a good feel in the room, right? Optimal transmission allows for emission, transmission, and absorption by the other, permitting optimal sustenance to the relationship, which allows the relationship and each person in it to experience relational nutrients such as care, support, love, dependency, security, respect, loyalty, positive regard, esteem. Okay? Again, this is where the mirror neurons in the brain and face kick in. You know, when you walk into a room, before you even recognize the person, you already have a flow from right brain to right brain of what you really think of them. Okay? That we've talked about how that's how joy is passed back and forth. That even before I visibly smile on my face, my eyes have already smiled at you. That kind of communication is always authentic. In fact, it's not only is it authentic, the reason it's authentic is because it happens too fast for us to control it. You know, think about how many times you've tried to fake it. You know, just imagine you've been downstairs looking at porn and you break away, you come upstairs and your wife is glad to see you and says, "Oh, hi, glad you came up." And you go, "Oh, I'm so glad to see you." The words are what you know that she wants to hear, but what's in the way? The eyes. Shame. This energy break. Because I'm not being authentic. And so the image here is, instead of the vibrations coming and matching, there's this conglomerate weirdness. And what do you think that does in the impact of the relationship? Transmission is weakened, diminished, eroded. It's low frequency waves. There's an incongruence and interference of waves. Instead of joy, there's shame communicated. Instead of joy, there's often contempt. Okay, because again, guys, what invariably happens in pornography? In pornography always leads us to impossibly compare our wife. You know, many of you have heard me talk about, probably 25 years ago, I heard Dennis Rainey on Family Life Radio. He said, "You know, I watched many times being at my grandparents' house, and my grandfather had been out plowing the field all day. And he'd come in the house after spending 12 hours looking at the southbound end of a northbound mule, and he would smile at my grandmother and give her a hug and say, 'You're the most beautiful thing I've seen today.'" And he meant it. But what happens when you've spent your day feasting on pornography? Feasting on 20-somethings with silicone implants, photoshopped, etc. Then you look at your wife, and your brain automatically compares. And are you really glad to see her? Are you really enthralled by her beauty? No, because your brain's in an addictive fog. And you can't see her beauty because there's too much in the way. And it creates this place where things don't line up. And it's especially true when there is deception involved. Because I'm telling her everything's okay, I'm telling her I'm sober, I'm telling her that she's the only one I have eyes for, I'm telling her all these things, but my eyes and my nonverbal behaviors are speaking louder than my words. So it leads to a weakening ability to depend on the partner. It leads to decreased security or stabilization of the attachment. It leads to increased feelings of isolation within the relationship. It leads to fewer expressions of emotional nurturance. It leads to increased likelihood of avoidance, the avoidance of touch, time, words of affirmation. It leads to increased feelings of aversion to the other and the relationship. And often that happens on both sides of the relationship because it's just the natural outgrowth of the incongruence. So, page 18 of your workbook. I want you to spend a couple minutes, 3 or 4 minutes, just journaling, answering these questions, and then we'll do a little sharing in that regard. Okay, let's take a few minutes just to hear some voices, just to hear what's impacting you about this idea of energy and about how deception fouls that up. So, what's happening inside of you?
If you're lying, you're being deceptive, you're not even wanting to connect.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's a yucky place, and the guilt's there, and you know you are, and you're feeling it. And so you're not even wanting to
Mm-hmm.
connect. They want you to just release.
Yeah. Find yourself sitting on the couch and you're having a conversation and you're not turning and looking because you know that it's incongruent. What else?
I think it puts you into this false sense of truth of ourselves, about yourself. You go into this state of hiding because, you want to be accepted or looked at in a certain way. So you're hiding really who you are.
Yeah.
Deceptive person.
Okay.
Well, authenticity is just the antithesis of deception, because if you're being authentic, you're building relationships. And if you're on the other side of it, being deceptive, you're actually tearing down
Mm-hmm.
and ruining relationships.
Mm-hmm.
One thought I had was honesty and authenticity open the doorway for connection, but there can also be a lot of disconnection. I don't necessarily equate honesty with good vibes. If
Not always.
I'm really honest and it leads to a fight.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a second. There's also a sense in which we've also learned that when I'm honest, sometimes it really gets ugly.
But it's real.
But it's real. And what I would say is that ugly honest is actually a much better vibe than nice and deceptive. In fact, I would say, I'll go ahead and say it this way. The ugliest of situations are the nicest guys who are especially able to keep the spin going. Okay? All right, guys, now I want you to just take a step back. There's a concept called the Gestalt. Gestalt means you step back and you see the big picture. So we've been through the first 3 rooms of the covert phase, where things are hidden. And so as you look at that big picture and picture that secret basement where, that original picture with the husband with the mask on and the wife thinks things are good and stuff's going on in the basement and fumes are coming up from the basement and all of that, what kind of big picture are you seeing about this first covert phase? Yeah. I mean, just think for a minute back on your life, how much work and effort you put into building, maintaining, and protecting that basement. Time, money, energy. And so is it any wonder that the repair is going to take significant time, money, energy, effort, etc.? Dudley?
Well, I was going to say, when you kind of look back at it like that, we're even
digging a deeper hole. And you need to understand, in a room this size, this many of us have had very different partner responses. There's some of you in here whose wives are, they were completely blindsided. They had no idea anything was going on. There's some of you in here whose wives are like, yeah, I've known he was lying to me all the time. I just didn't know what to do about it. Andy?
I think what's crazy for me is, I look at this basement analogy, is I think of myself as someone who keeps convincing myself that I can dig another basement.
Yeah.
And so it's almost like I'm trying to dig a basement and I live at sea level or something. And I'm like, I can make a little basement over here. And then it floods in pretty quickly. A few days later, maybe I can make a little basement over here.
Yeah. Reg?
I think reflecting back, I think about the hardest part for me is how many years I stole from my wife in a primary relationship that she counted on.
Yeah. I don't know if you could hear Reg in the back. He said, I think about how many years I stole from my wife who wanted a primary relationship, and there wasn't one available because I was in this covert hiding place. That's a real tragedy.
Yeah, I think for me what it is that place, I always felt very comfortable and I thought I was doing well in life. And there was times that my wife would tell me like, where are you? You're not here. And I did all the gaslighting saying, maybe it's a you problem. I think you have an intimacy problem. So for me it's like that space I felt like was the best I could do at that point. And it was the best I could do was having all that. And so with that, it's like, clearly it was just a selfish way to try to self-medicate my life. I lived my whole life on a morphine drip. And so it's trying to come to the reality of the selfishness of that and the inability to see anybody else's, how my problems were affecting anybody else, was just totally, I was just wrapped up in it.
And he brings up a great point in that regard, is we were doing this because we were numbing and medicating our own painful things. We were doing this because many of us were taught this. I was conditioned for deception. I mean, I can give you a whole litany of examples of how my religious leader, preacher, then elder, then et cetera, father, constantly taught me that, yeah, but there's good reasons for deception.
I think there's a payoff too, because when I would act out and I would be so scared that I would get caught, but then afterwards when I did get caught, it was almost like I got this feeling of, gee, I'm clever, I'm smart, and so then there's this payoff, I got from.
There's dopamine hits tremendously from getting away with it. I can't tell you how many guys I've talked to through the years who would tell their story, and you could see the euphoric recall when they talked with glee about how they pulled this one over on their wife.
It's sad, but it's true.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in my experience.
Yeah.
I've been doing this for a long time, and I had this gnawing understanding that sooner or later, I was going to get caught.
Mm-hmm.
It's a nagging thing, and that realization is painful.
Yeah. Many of us live this place of, okay, well, someday it's going to come out. And obviously it did come out or you wouldn't be here. And maybe somebody, but just think of the tragedy of it never came out. Okay, for example, I spent some time talking to a woman several years ago. Oh, what a tragedy. Her pastor husband died. Had the funeral. still living in the church house, going through his stuff. The church is being supported. Everyone saw her husband as this incredible saint. And then one day in going through his stuff, she started digging deeper into his laptop and found his basement. Found, I think if I remember right the story, at least one affair, lots of pornography, etc., etc. He successfully took it to his grave. Guess where that left her? She can't tell anybody there because the church is still supporting her. Yeah. But also just think what, and here's the crazy part about it is, she still loved him. And let me tell you what that man missed out on. He missed out on the opportunity to experience the forgiveness of a woman who was willing to work through the hard stuff with him. I have no doubt, I've probably talked to her maybe 3, 4, or 5 hours through the years. I have no doubt that woman would have walked through hell and back with him. And instead, he took it to his grave. And now she has to walk through it alone. Okay? Guys, the covert phase, all the phases are ugly, but covert phase, I want you to have that perspective of how damaging, how unfair, how horrific it is to have a basement, no matter what's in the basement, and think that's okay. Now, I understand where thinking it's okay comes from. We were culturized that way. We have been taught that on so many levels. And it's wrong.
If it's okay, why do we keep it a secret?
Yeah, exactly. All right? Okay, let's move on to the exposure phase. The exposure phase is when the PRE, the pre-existing reality ego, who the wife thinks she is, this is my world, this is who I am, intersects with the secret sexual basement. She sticks her head down the hatch and says, "Oh my, what's down here?" And in this exposure phase, there's 5 rooms. There's exposure phase integrity abuse. That's the IABs. We'll talk about those in a minute. There's the discovery trauma. What happens when she finds it? There's the disclosure trauma. What happens when she's told about it? There's the reality ego fragmentation. If that term sounds too crazy for you, well, just hang on. I'll explain it. It actually makes a lot of sense. And then there's the acute relational rupture and attachment injury. We're going to start in room 7. The one I said might sound strange to you at first. Reality ego fragmentation. And I think this picture does it very well. This picture was drawn by a woman in one of Dr. Manwala's treatment programs. The left side is the world she thought she had. The right side is her world post-discovery. My nice house, my lovely child, my wonderful husband, we're all holding hands, we're all smiled, we're living the good life. And then, what the hell happened? Reality ego fragmentation is sudden or progressive loss or injury to self, partner, relationship, reality. Cognitive structures are damaged, upon which other cognitive concepts depend. Okay? This is not a window being broken. This is the foundation crumbling. Emotional constructs are altered or changed. Many wives talk about it as a death of self or reality. It relates to what's called criteria A of PTSD. PTSD, to be diagnosed, has a number of criteria. Criteria A fits well right here. It's not a physical injury, but it is a deep injury to self. And it also activates fear into a system to where they live their life afraid. And remember what happens when you're in fear? Sympathetic nervous system is activated. I'm elevated heart rate, elevated cortisol levels. I'm in a constant state of anxiety, and that has huge implications. It's also helpful to think of reality ego fragmentation as a global injury versus a local injury. It doesn't affect one part of me, it affects all of me. This tsunami type idea in this picture. Okay, it is a shattering of reality. The floor collapses and the house falls into the secret basement. And Wallace's metaphor here that we'll look at in a bit is that of a car crash. It's the secret sexual world crashes into the pre-existing reality. It feels like a tsunami, house burned down, total and global devastation. It's a shattered world. We're all at least somewhat familiar with the concept of PTSD, originally found as a diagnosis for individuals coming back from war zones, where they are triggered into reliving experiences. Well, these are those categories. Category A is exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. Category B is intrusions, distressing memories, dreams, disassociation, and intense psychological or physiological stress with exposure to reminders. Category C is avoidance or numbing. D is negative alterations in cognition and mood. Category E is alterations in arousal and reactivity. And category F is disassociated symptoms. And I'm guessing most of you are realizing my wife has had or has some, most, or all of these. Again, it's where these two worlds come together. The pre-existing reality, the secret sexual basement. And when they crash together, the outcome is almost always those 6 categories of PTSD. Again, the analogy is that of a car crash. The world I thought I knew, the secret sexual basement. And when that happens when there's partial and or staggered disclosures. Or let me backtrack for a minute. The abuse behaviors, the things that shape this, create this, are partial and or staggered disclosures. I can't tell you how many couples I've worked with and initial session or whatever, and the wife says, or the husband may say, yeah, I've had a porn problem, there's this, this, and this, and the wife says, yeah, but the only thing he ever has confessed to is that he's been specifically caught with. For many years, I've described it as the tip of the iceberg. 99 out of 100 men who've come to me through the years have confessed the tip of the iceberg. Let me rephrase that. 100 out of 100 who have come to me have confessed the tip of the iceberg. There have been a few who I genuinely believe confessed all they knew how to confess, but their deep denial and their just inability to see the whole picture left much of the iceberg still below the water and unattended. Okay? Another behavior there is avoiding responsibility or taking accountability. Yeah, I looked at porn, but it's no big deal. Well, wait a second. Was it part of your understood agreement when you got married? You know, when you told your wife you were going to forsake all others, how do you think she heard that? Okay? It comes with I hate that word. Yeah, that word, the victim or the relationship. Pathologizing the victim or the relationship. Okay? You know, you're such an exaggerator. You make a mountain out of a molehill. Or, well, of course I look at porn. We only have sex once a month. Or, of course I look at porn. You make me crazy. I got to find sanity someplace. The lying, the gaslighting, the manipulating of truth, anger, threats, belittling, jokes, minimizing, justifying, rationalizing. And so here's a metaphor I want you to think of. We think at this stage that I've got this little problem. We think, you know, in our compartmentalized thinking, we think, you know, I make a good living, I provide for her, I provide for the kids, I take us all to church, I do this good thing, I do this good thing, I do this good thing, and yeah, I got a little problem with porn. Or yeah, I've got a little problem with masturbation and being honest about it. Or yeah, I've got 13 mistresses, but it's really, you know, it's amazing how we compartmentalize, okay? And so we think of it as a little tiny drop of ink. But what happens if you put one drop of ink in a glass of crystal clear water? It taints everything. So a person experiencing the impact of the reality ego fragmentation that comes with the exposure and experiencing the car crash of DST says, I feel like this entire relationship has been based on lies. To which we say, no, I only lied to you about this stuff. Well, one, most individuals I work with, myself included, have a deeper addiction to deception than we even did to the sexual deceptions. We lied about things that didn't matter. Okay? Because we learned in childhood that what mattered is not what I really did, but what I think you want to hear so that I'm not abandoned, rejected, or punished severely. So we got really good at reading the room, reading whoever was questioning us. And they ask us a question, and our brain doesn't go to what really happened. Our brain goes to what do they want to hear, and we give it to them. So, a stupid illustration from my own story is when we first moved here to Lawrence, money was incredibly tight. And so I would come home in the evening, and we'd be getting dinner together or whatever, and Debbie would ask me what I did for lunch today. And you have to understand, I was even heavier then. I wasn't carrying some extra weight from the holidays. I was carrying a lot of weight, period. So I also had this but I knew my wife was fearful or, didn't like my diet, so to speak. So whenever she asked me what I did for lunch today, what I did for lunch was irrelevant. The only thing that mattered is which fear was currently activated. So if my current fear at the moment was our finances, I would say I went to Burger King and got a $1 double cheeseburger. If my current fear was her reaction to my bad diet, then I would say I went to Hy-Vee and got a salad bar. Now, here's the crazy part about that, guys. There were some Tuesdays that I went to Hy-Vee and got a salad bar, and I told her I went to Burger King. And there were some Wednesdays I went to Burger King and I told her I went to Hy-Vee. That's crazy, guys. But think about how crazy making it is on the other side of the equation. And so we think of it as a drop in the water, but it affects everything. You know, your wife begins to look back at memories and history, and she says, you know, you remember this great vacation you went to Hawaii and the snorkeling and being with the kids, et cetera, and her mind goes, so did he want to go to Hawaii just so he could watch all the women in bikinis? Every memory, every experience, when exposure hits, changes. Another metaphor that's helped is think of it like a computer virus. A computer virus gets into the system and it corrupts every file in the hard drive. Even though it's true that a great Hawaiian vacation occurred, the memory in the victim is no longer in its original form. And their brain's able to pick out memories. Maybe you were distant. Maybe you couldn't be found. Maybe there was 20 minutes she couldn't find you. And so guess what her brain concludes with that? Rightly or wrongly, it doesn't matter. Okay? And the emotions around that memory are also attached to that experience, are now going to be altered, which then changes the systems of meaning that surround it. We think, oh yeah, I've got this porn problem and it's this little thing here, but the other 90% of our relationship is good. I can't tell you guys how many times men, or even sometimes couples say, yeah, we have a really good marriage except for this. And what I will tell you is, that's the compartmentalization talking. And it doesn't work because it surrounds everything. Okay? Reality, ego, fragmentations, room 7. Room 4 is exposure phase, integrity abuse shaping. So this is where integrity abuse behaviors, remember we had the list earlier, now we have a new list with some overlaps. These are behaviors that come up in this part of the cycle. She knows some, not all, but at least, there's some light in the basement now. And guess what? We continue to lie. Well, yeah, I've looked at porn, but I haven't looked at porn in 3 months. Yeah, I've looked at porn. I haven't looked at porn in 3 months. Well, what about this history of this? Or there's the lying by omission, where our wife maybe asks even a specific question and we don't really answer it. We dodge it. Or we know that she needs some specific information and we deliberately leave it out. Okay, it's amazing to me how many men will even go through a disclosure process and leave details out as a way of protecting themselves. I try to remember to tell every man I do disclosure with, you need to step back and take a minute and try to grasp some concept of how hard this process is for your wife. And just her going through, I can't tell you how many times Debbie and I have talked about just how brutal it is for a wife to go through the disclosure materials and have to decide what their questions are. To look at lists and things that other people have done, or be in women's groups, or go online and read, and their minds are blown because there's stuff that people have done that they never even knew was possible, and now they're having to say, could my husband have done this? And to go through a disclosure process and intentionally leave something out? Guys, that's cruel. Don't do it. Don't do it. Okay, we're not going to go through this list because we time's sake, it's in my manual. I have a combined list that includes all three phases. But what I want you to see is that these same integrity abuse behaviors recur. And then some new ones come up. Because, before she knew anything, there were some of these that we didn't have to be near as good at, like stonewalling. Many of your wives, when they found out this much, they went in full detective mode with 12 million questions, and one of our defense mechanisms was to come up big, stonewall, shut them down, deflect. And so we had a whole new set of ways to shut them down, protect the background, and move forward. And what I want you to see there is that integrity abuse at the scene of the accident makes it much worse. And the image Minwalla has here is, imagine the at-fault driver gets out of his car and instead of tending to the victim, lights up a cigarette and just takes in the scene or goes someplace else in his mind. What that means is you've got the post-traumatic stress of discovery, and now you've got integrity abuse on top of it. Exposure phase involves both the reality fragmentation and post-trauma symptoms, but also in the midst of experiencing those post-trauma symptoms, more integrity abuse. Again, guys, it would be absolutely amazing if when it all blew up, when it comes out of the light, the guy just says, okay, I'm not going to harm her anymore. I'm going to stop hurting her. I'm going to tell the truth. I'm going to get everything in the light. And we try, but we suck at it, one. And two, our defenses kick in. And we accentuate the harm. It's also critical to note that cluelessness leads to callousness. When we do not recognize the car crash in front of us, when we do not identify abuse as abuse, then we are likely to approach the situation in a way that is clumsy, callous, and insensitive. Being unaware and not seeing the problems that exist make it difficult to respond in a healthy way. In other words, being clueless means being callous. Abusers don't recognize themselves as such, are likely to engage in continued integrity abuse behaviors after their victims discover secret sexual basements. In such cases, the victims do not receive the immediate help and assistance they so desperately need and instead endure more continued abuse. Guys, when it blows up on us, yes, we absolutely have to be focused on stopping the sexual acting out. That's a given. But if we are so focused on our sobriety and are not acting out sexually and are oblivious to all these other ways that we're throwing darts and beating our wives with clubs, guess what? Very little recovery. No recovery for the wife. Some of the hardest cases I've worked with have been guys who found sobriety easy right away. Because then it's a place of, well, I don't do that anymore. What's the problem? Get over it. I haven't acted out in X amount of days, years. And so there's just this mindset of cluelessness. Because they haven't really looked at how deep the impact truly is. It's also important to note that most everyone in society is blind to this specific abuse and trauma that we're calling DST. Some of you in here, and I'm not thinking of anyone in particular, I just know the percentages of it, I know the way it happens. Some of you have had pastors and counselors who've colluded with you in ways that perpetuate some of these continued abuses. Now, they haven't colluded with you in the sexual acting out, but they've colluded with you in the sense of, hey, he's been clean for 3 months, so why are we still having problems here? He's not looking at porn anymore, so why aren't you sleeping with him? And oh, if you don't sleep with him, then he's going to probably go back to porn again. Very few people in our culture, our world today, have become illuminated on this impact. And when they are not fully illuminated, they are likely to be clueless and callous, well-intentioned, well-meaning people. And I tell you guys that in part because I believe you have a place to protect your wife, even if your pastor or counselor is jumping into some of these places. There is a place for you to stand up and say, no, I don't think you understand how much the impact really is, was, and continues to be. Absolutely not. I will tell you guys this part too. Even after this seminar, even after all the training I've done with Minwala and other places, after reading Sherry Keffer's Intimate Deception, after all the intellectual work I could do to understand the true impacts of this, I will never fully understand the impacts of this. But the more I understand it, the more motivation I have to not repeat it, the greater compassion and empathy I have for my wife's struggles, and the greater reliance of crying out, Lord, have mercy. And the greater willingness for me to join Paul and say, yeah, I'm chief of all sinners because look what I did to my wife. And therefore, the only thing I can depend on is the grace of God through Jesus Christ. Brings us full circle back to the gospel over and over. Dave?
Okay, let's be honest with you. I mean, this is really terrific material. What I'm still struggling to do is, my wife said, I really want you to go to Daryl's seminar because I want you to understand how much you've hurt me.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if it's going to be in this more in this material, or maybe I've been too clueless and missed it, or
something, but how can I, because, I'm falling into the trap which you're talking about, where, say, I haven't acted out for a while, and so I'm thinking, why is she still so mad?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if I need to read a book or see a video or something where somebody would go, okay, here's what this is like. And they would paint this graphic picture. I mean, I don't know if I would need to go to think about my wife betraying me and having affairs, or I'm struggling
Sure.
to be empathetic and to really feel the impact.
Okay, there's a number of things there, Dave, and I just want to touch on these, and then we'll take a break. Learning this stuff helps. It doesn't accomplish it. It's important, but it continues to have to go deeper. And with that, just a quick note here. I don't think you can grasp this content fully when you're still in addictive fogs. And what I mean by that is that when you're in your own cycles of addiction, cycles of acting out, that it's like we're walking through life in a fog. And one of the things that I've seen through the many years of working with men is it's like you can see guys' eyes start to open up when they get 3-6 months of sobriety. They can't see fully, but now they can see more than they used to could see. You say, well, then why am I here if I haven't gotten that amount of sobriety? Okay? I think for some men, learning and grasping more of this material may be just what helps them get to a place so the gears fall in place so they're able to get more sobriety, so that they are able to begin to see it more clearly. And then closely connected with that too is it's also part of the deepening of our own individual work. Empathy is not, there are things we can learn about empathy. There are intellectual concepts and even some skills we can practice. But mostly it has to be grown. And a big part of it is we have to experience it for ourselves, within ourselves. If you've not done the work to allow God to really heal the deep, wounded, broken places within you so that you can look back at your 6-year-old self or 8-year-old self or different places where you were wounded and have great compassion and even weep over that child that was wounded, then you're going to have a layer of glaze over your heart that makes it impossible to have that kind of empathy and compassion for your wife. And that's one of the reasons why, guys, it has to be a both and. It's stopping behavior and it's looking deep and understanding what caused me to be this way. It's digging in deep and doing the hard work of doing intensives, of doing individual therapy, of doing the work that gets into my story so that I understand what made me this way and why have I responded this way all my life to this point. It's why your own journaling, your own Emmanuel prayer work, your own sharing your story with one another, it all blends together. And there is no magic bullet. If there was, I would be a wealthy, wealthy man, even if I sold it dirt cheap. There is no formula, but there are day by day steps we can take to inch forward, to move forward, to choose to live differently. And so, maybe this is a good place to wrap up before we take a break. But again, it's why I've become so convinced that making your own personal, we call it a personal IAB list. So page 248 of my New Hope for Sexual Integrity Recovery Manual has a compilation of Minwala's lists. And what I've been instructing guys to do for the last 6 months or so is to go through that list and pick out your top 10 or 12. Some guys look at that list and they say, well, I do all of them. Yeah, well, if you try to focus on all of them, you're going to focus on nothing. Pick out 10 or 12 that are your most harmful or most frequent behaviors. Put it on an index card, put it in a note on your phone, and daily look at it. And then here's the real kicker. Check in about it. I was just tickled pink the other day on Zoom because one of the guys was talking about a simple situation that he has usually lied about. Some of you were on there, you know what I'm talking about. I don't think he'd mind if I give the example. His wife asked him, "Did you take those pills I put out for you? Got some health issues?" He said everything within him wanted to say, "Yeah, I took them." He hadn't taken them. So in a moment of honesty, he said, "I know it's going to piss you off, but I haven't taken them." And she was angry. And she came back to him later and she said, "Wow, I'm really proud of you for telling the truth." Part of the reason that he made that shift that sounds little, it's huge, guys, is because it was on his list. And day after day, he's checked in on it. And previously, he's checked in on, yeah, my wife asked me a question and I told her what she wanted to hear instead of what was true. When you focus on them, when you give focused attention, your behavior starts changing. And the reason I think making your own personal list is so valuable is that task number one is not sobriety. Task number one is reducing the harm that we create. Sobriety is part of that, but a bigger part, a more important thing, is how do I reduce the harm that I'm doing to the one that I love the most? So, make your list. Check in on it daily with brothers in recovery. New Hope provides that opportunity, but if that doesn't work for you, find a space that does. I don't care where you do it. I'm just thrilled when you do it because that's when change happens.
Does that list appear in this scan?
No, it's page 248 of my New Hope for Sexual Integrity Recovery Manual. I've got copies here if anybody doesn't have one and wants to buy one, or you can get the digital version online as well.
You call it a list of what? It's a list of
IABs, Integrity Abuse Behaviors.